Hello, my name is Nathan Massey. I'm also known as Nathanael Leo in the music world. You can check out my music on any streaming platform, including Apple Music and Spotify.
Oh, take the light off me. Give it to those in need.
I'm here today to talk about the circle of fifths. Maybe you've heard of it, maybe you haven't. If you have heard of it, maybe you don't know what it is or how it relates to music. That's what we will be discussing in this video. I hope you enjoy. For this video, I will be demonstrating on a piano, which is laid out much simpler than most other instruments. Not to mention, it's my main instrument, and I want to show off my baby grand piano. However, the concepts that I'll be discussing today can be applied to any other musical instrument. Before we talk about the circle of fifths, there are some terms and theory that we need to go over for those that don't have much of a music background. The concepts needed to understand the circle of fifths include the music alphabet, half steps, whole steps, accidentals, scales, key signatures, and intervals. It's quite a bit, so let's dive in. Let's start first with the music alphabet. The music alphabet is really simple to understand as long as you passed kindergarten.
A, B, C, D, E, F, G.
It is the first 7 letters of the English alphabet, A through G, which repeats over and over again. This is easy to see on a piano. All right, we're just warming up. Let's now talk about half steps and whole steps. On the piano, this is also very easy to see. If you pick a note on the piano and go to the very next note, either higher or lower, including black keys, you just moved a half step. For example, if I start on the note C and play the black key next to it, that is a half step up. If I go back to the C and play the next note down, this example of a half step is still on a white key, B, because there isn't a black key in between B and C. If I were to play several half steps in a row, it would look like this. After you understand half steps, whole steps are really simple to understand. They are simply 2 half steps put together. Essentially, you skip over the first half step and land on the second half step. Let's start on C again. If I were to go up a whole step, I would skip the black key from before and land on D. If I start on C again and go down a whole step, I would skip the B and land on this black key called B flat. Which brings me to my next discussion point, accidentals. You may have heard the terms sharps and flats. These are the 2 most common accidentals. Typically, sharps or flats will result in the pianist playing a black key on the piano, but this is not always the case. A sharp is when a note is played a half step higher, while a flat is when a note is played a half step lower. For example, if I start on the note D and play a half step higher, this black key can be called D sharp. If I go back to the D and play a half step lower, this other black key can be called D flat. Are you still with me?
Jack, we're with you, Jack.
All right, let's now talk about scales and key signatures. These 2 things go hand in hand. Quick note, in this video, I'll be talking specifically about major scales, although there are other types of scales. A scale, simply put, is a pattern of notes, typically using a pattern of half steps and whole steps. Every major scale has the same pattern, no matter what note you start on. That pattern is whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, half step. When I would teach this to my piano students, I would love to make a rap out of it. Whole, half, whole, half, whole, half, Whatever works for you. For example, the easiest scale to play on the piano is a C major scale, which looks like this. Or like some of my piano students try to do. Please don't play with one finger. Notice that this scale contains only white keys. In fact, this is the only major scale on the piano like this. Every other major scale has at least one black key within it, which is kind of how we have the circle of fifths, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's now talk about key signatures. All scales have their own key signature, which is essentially the number of sharps and flats within the scale. If you played a major scale starting from each note on the piano, each of these scales would have a different number of accidentals within them. For example, while the C major scale has no sharps or flats, the A major scale, for example, has 3 sharps. The F major scale has 1 flat. The G major scale has 1 sharp. And the C flat major scale has 7 flats. It can be and often is written in sheet music like this. So, to reiterate, every single major scale on the piano has a different number of accidentals. This means that every one of those major scales has a different key signature. This is important to know to understand the circle of fifths. Our last discussion point before we get to the circle of fifths is intervals. An interval is simply the distance between 2 notes. This can be explained in a couple of different ways, but given our goal of understanding the circle of fifths, I'm going to explain it in terms of scale numbers. If you play a scale from left to right, each note in that scale can be given a number. For example, in a C major scale, C could be given the number 1, D would be number 2, E would be number 3, and so on until we reach C again. As you may or may not have guessed, our goal in this lesson is to get to scale step number 5. Another way to find a fifth on the piano is to simply count 7 half steps. Using this method can sometimes be easier, especially if you're going backwards in the scale. More on that in a little bit. But let's celebrate, we made it! The circle of fifths encompasses all of these things to create, you guessed it, a circle. In explicit detail, this could be called a circle of scales where the scale of each scale step 5 adds or subtracts sharps or flats in its scale. I'll stick with the circle of fifths. I actually like the circle of fifths so much, I have a mouse pad of it. Let's now take a look at the circle of fifths and what it is showing. For our purposes in this video, let's only focus on the number of sharps and flats within each scale. Notice at the top, it's the C major scale we have discussed a couple times already. It contains no sharps or flats. Let's first move around the scale to the right, clockwise. Can you figure out what the 5th note of the C major scale would be by looking at the piano? That's right, it's G. Why is this important? If you start on the letter G and create a major scale, that scale would contain 1 sharp. Let's do it again. This time starting on G and creating a G major scale. What would be the 5th note of the G major scale? That's right, it's D. The cool thing is, if you create a major scale starting from D, That scale contains 2 sharps. If you continue this pattern, more and more sharps will be added to these scales until you get to the F sharp major scale. But let's go back for a second and look at going counterclockwise to the left, starting from C at the top. Going backwards in the scale can be a bit trickier, which is why I want you to recall the second way that we can figure out a fifth, which is counting 7 half steps. A little side note, yes, you can technically find the fifth by going backwards, but it is a little more confusing because the note you end up on is not actually scale step number 5. In fact, it's scale step number 4, which makes it even more confusing. We will stick with counting 7 half steps down for this purpose, especially since soon we will start discussing scales that start on black keys. If you count 7 half steps down from C, what note do you end up on? Yes, F. Now, if going clockwise to the right gave each scale sharps, it's only fitting that going to the left will give each scale flats. So, the F major scale has 1 flat. Let's now figure out which scale would have 2 flats. Count 7 half steps backwards. Did you end up on B flat? Good. The B flat major scale has 2 flats, including, you guessed it, B flat. Continuing this pattern creates scales with more and more flats. Now you may ask, how is this a circle when there are scales containing sharps and scales containing flats? Do they overlap somehow? Well, yes they do. Let's review sharps and flats for a second. If you look at a black key on the piano, it can have 2 different names. For example, take this black key shown here. It can be called C sharp because it is a half step higher than C, but it can also be called D flat because it is a half step lower than D. The bottom of the circle shows where these overlapping scales occur. The most important one is the G flat F sharp scale. This is the truest transition from sharps to flats, or vice versa, making it easy to transition into the next part of the circle. Let's pretend like we continued from earlier, going clockwise to the right around the circle. Once we get to the bottom, the F sharp scale could now be called the G flat scale. Each of these scales contains the same exact notes on the piano, just with different names. If you continued to go clockwise, still using the first method of finding fifths, which is counting to the 5th scale step, you would now be removing flats for each of the scales you come across. For example, in going from the G flat scale at the bottom to the D flat scale, 1 flat is removed. The same thing from the D flat scale to the A flat scale, then to the E flat scale, and so on, all the way back to the C at the top, containing no sharps or flats. In summary, we learned how the circle of fifths works by discussing the music alphabet, half steps, whole steps, accidentals, scales, key signatures, and intervals. I hope you now see why I love the circle of fifths. Without scales, there would be no music. So this connects all music together. If you are a musician, I hope I brought some knowledge to your music journey. If you're not a musician, I hope I brought you a little bit of light into the vast world of music. Thank you for joining me. Hope to see you real soon.